So, good morning, everyone. I'm the chair of the seminars at ICAQ that are supported by BSF Spain. And today we have slightly different talk of the ones that you are typically used to hear. Today we have Professor Mike Rosenberg from the IESE Business School. And he will be talking about strategy and sustainability. He has a very good book related to this that was published in 2015. And the reason why Mike is here today is that he invited Emilio Palomares, our director, to teach what we are doing to his students of sustainability. And now he's paying the visit back. So thank you very much, Mike, for coming. And if you find something missing in the presentation, thank you.
Thank you very much, Nuria. No, it's fine. I'm a professor of a business school, and you may wonder why would a professor of a business school want to speak to a group of scientists. But clearly, without your science, we're not going to do what we need to do as the society. I'm speaking in English. I understand you come from all over the world. If my English is too quick, please, someone send a message in the chat and say, please ask him to slow down. And Nuria or Judith, if you see anything in the chat you think I need to know, please interrupt me and say, Professor, the people in the chat are saying that they don't understand, et cetera, and we'll go to questions at the end. My idea essentially is to explain a little bit how I see this topic, and then give you a number of examples of companies which are really pushing hard on this, and all of them who need the science that you guys are coming up with. They actually need it tomorrow, even though I know it's going to take 5 to 10 years for some of the stuff in your lab to get into the world. But anyway, just to start, when we talk about sustainability, typically we talk about the mix between the social, economic, and environmental sphere of human activity, how those three things come together. The idea basically is if we put them together, we can make a society which is both just or fair, which is viable, where we can actually live in it, and of course habitable. So something which will last over time and something which will be good for all the people who live on the planet. This is the fundamental idea. When we talk about business and the environment, however, it's a complicated relationship. If you talk to ecologists and you look at what's happening on the planet, people talk about 2050, 2100. They talk about decades. They talk about parts per million in the atmosphere. Business people don't get any of that typically. Business people think about the next quarter, the next 3 months, the end of year results. They think about sales and profits and KPIs in their day-to-day life, which is very, very different and typically much more short-term than some of these environmental issues. And when you get a conversation sometimes between ecologists and business leaders, there's a very, very low communication. In Spanish, you call it a diálogo de besugos, or a conversation between two fish. And they say that dolphins communicate, but I'm not sure that just normal fish communicate very well. Anyway, so it's a complicated story, which I've been spending the last 20 years more or less trying to help with. Now, one of the reasons it's complicated is because it's relatively new. Now, I know many of you are younger than I am, but if you go back to the 1960s, I was born in 1962, the world was a very different place. And just an example of how different it was, there's a chemical compound called DDT, invented by a Swiss chemist, Müller, in the 1930s. He won the Nobel Prize for this invention. DDT is the best thing in the world for killing mosquitoes. And in fact, they were using DDT after the Second World War to eliminate malaria all over the world. Here's an image from the 1960s in the US where the trucks would spray the entire neighborhood or even the swimming pool with the children in it with DDT because it killed all the mosquitoes. And I remember when I was a child, they would spray the neighborhood because they didn't want us to get mosquito bites. Now, in 1962, a woman called Rachel Carson published a book. I don't know if you know it well. It's called Silent Spring. Mrs. Carson was a writer about nature. She wrote about the mountains and the trees. And she was concerned about this stuff. And she said, well, but if DDT kills the insects, what will the birds eat? And if the birds don't have anything to eat, we won't have any birds, and there will be no song in the spring, and we'll have a silent spring. And she said, this stuff is dangerous, and we don't know what the long-term effects will be. In fact, there was a television program, 60 Minutes. They had a special on her book and her ideas, and they invited a gentleman from the chemical industry to talk. And he says, but come on, this lady's not a scientist. She has no data. She has no proof. You know, we're going to stop using the best insecticide we ever made just because there's a lady worried about something? Come on, this is crazy. That was 1962. It took 10 years for the world to ban DDT after that. Yeah. In 1968, an American astronaut, Bill Anders, was orbiting the moon. If you remember, the Americans tried to get to the moon. Before they landed on the moon, they were taking photographs of the moon to figure out where to land. And the astronaut who was supposed to take the photographs looked up out the window and saw the Earth rising in the morning. And he was so amazed that he moved the camera, he wasn't supposed to, and took a picture of the Earth rising. And this photograph, which was called Earthrise, really changed how the world looks at the planet. Now, all of you were born after the photograph. All of you have seen this photograph your whole life. But you cannot imagine how it changed people's conception. And this was in 1968. You know, the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States was founded in 1972. And the reason I'm making this point is we've only been working on this problem for about 50 or 60 years, which explains to some degree why we don't have it right and why we've done so much damage. It takes longer for the world to kind of change the way it behaves. But the point of my talk today is it's starting to change. And it's in a very, very exciting time for this thing. Because in those years, since the 1960s, the world has gotten tremendously rich. I don't know if you look at the GDP, the gross domestic product of the planet, you know, and it's just gone up and up and up and up as people have, you know, acquired televisions and refrigerators and cars, and we've built highways and airplanes and everything in our modern society, you know, making theme parks, you know, and anything else, making the world a much richer place. According to a guy from Harvard, Steven Pinker, this is because of the fundamental ideas of the Enlightenment. And one of the ideas he talks about is scientific inquiry and the importance of science and new technology to fuel this enormous rise of human prosperity around the planet, with hundreds and hundreds of millions of people coming out of poverty. There's another writer, he died 2 years ago, Hans Rosling, a Swede, who said, the world is better off than we think it is. And people are not so poor anymore. And in fact, the idea that there's a rich world and a poor world is a bit wrong. It's really a spectrum of richer to poor. I recommend any of those for people interested. But the problem is all of this wealth has produced an ecological disaster. An ecological disaster which we see in slowly melting ice caps. We see it in stronger storms because a very small temperature rise adds more energy to the atmosphere, which makes the storm stronger. We see it in desertification. We also see it in water and air pollution. This is an image of Chongqing, a city on the Yangtze, about 1,500 kilometers upriver from Shanghai. And one day in 2012, the river turned red. And we still, nobody really knew why. It took a few days for the river to clean itself up, but clearly it was some kind of industrial accident. The image below is New Delhi on any day before COVID times, where the smog is so bad you can barely breathe. And of course, we have pollution, and we have this enormous problem of plastic in the sea. Some of that plastic, let's be honest, the raw material for the plastic was made in Tarragona at the petrochemical facilities there. So this is a real problem, but created because of our wealth. Now, COVID-19 has been a terrible thing for so many families, for so many people around the world, and is still ravaging India. But this image is from a village, a town in the Punjab, which is just off the Himalayas. And I was giving a speech like this once to a bunch of former students, and one of the women, who's about 30, says, Professor, I've never seen the mountains from my home before. Because of lockdown and some of the other measures to control the virus, the global economy has shrank about 7%, but also emissions have gone down globally about 6%. And in many parts of the world, the air has gotten cleaner. So one of the things is, we have to shut down the economy to make a small drop in carbon emissions. But the other thing is the world reacts very quickly to just a little bit less damage, which I think is very hopeful. Anyway, the biggest issue probably is climate change. And the world has been working on this since 1992. Now, again, some of my students, they say, come on, 25 years of this thing and we're still not there yet. But it takes a long time to change the direction of governments from around the world. But in 1992 in Rio, they had an Earth Summit, the first kind of global meeting about this stuff. They created the United Nations framework that we have to do something. And then these meetings that happen all the time are the conference of the parties, the people who signed the framework, the governments which signed the framework. The big one was in Paris, number 21, where they made the Paris Climate Accord, which is a big deal. I can talk about it in questions if you want. The next one coming up is theoretically in Glasgow, although they're talking about postponing it because of the pandemic. But this has been the process, and part of that process has been the establishment of a governmental organization, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has been studying this thing. And they produce their reports every 5 or 6 years, and basically have concluded over time, climate change is real, it's because of what we're doing, and we have to stop. That's kind of the summary of the last report. In the last report was, what does it take to keep the average temperature rise on the planet at or below 1.5 degrees centigrade, and what will happen if it goes above? That was reported a couple of years ago, and this is more or less the pathway that they're looking at. And it's a little bit scary, because if we do go past 1.5 degrees, the weather is going to get very, very serious. This lady is Christiana Figueres. I saw her in Lisbon at something called Web Summit. This is when a bunch of young people come together to talk about the internet and new apps, and they have investors and companies. And this is just a few years ago. It seems hard to believe, but they had 70,000 people at the convention center in Lisbon, and it was a lot of fun. Anyway, I saw Christiana talk, and her message, more or less, is that the world will decarbonize our energy mix one way or another. Either in these 2000s, in the next 10 years, governments around the world will set higher standards, industry around the world will work to decarbonize its own operations, energy will move to renewable sources, and we will keep to 1.5 or 1.7 degrees centigrade and avoid the worst impact of climate change. This is one idea. The other idea is we will not do that in the next 10 years. The situation will continue to get worse, and the 2030s will have such terrible weather events, even worse than today, that the world will end up doing the same thing a little bit too late and wasting a lot of money. But her point is not so much if this is going to happen, but when is it going to happen? And she's very compelling. And this is the lady who negotiated the Paris Climate Accord when she worked for the United Nations. So I tend to believe her. So the real question, and this is really what this talk is about, is are we at the tipping point? Are we at the moment when things will start to change? I believe we are. There's a lot of indications to say that we are there, and that as we change, we're going to need the stuff in your labs, which Emilio was kind enough to explain to my students. We're going to need it every idea, every project, every innovation, and we're going to need it soon. So talking about business. Now, the good news is in most businesses by now, the idea that sustainability is consistent with profits is already done. If you use less raw materials, if your logistics are more efficient, if your energy is more efficient, if you produce less waste, if you manage what you're liable for and comply with the law, you will spend less money. So most companies are doing this, but they're doing it typically at the operations level, at the head of the refinery, the head of the factory, the head of the logistics network. What interests me more is kind of the more strategic issues that might happen at the boardroom. Now, this is an old image of what a board might have looked like a long time ago. And these days, you'll see people of color, and you'll see women, and you'll see more representative people. You hope, anyway. And there's 6 issues which I think are very, very important. One is is, or 7, excuse me. One is if consumers care. Now, is a small segment of consumers, many of you are probably some of them, who will spend more money for food, personal products, and certain things which you think are more beneficial for the environment. Some of you might participate in the circular economy. You know, I get my wine from a store which has a barrel, and I fill up the bottle and take it home. These kinds of things, yeah. The problem is it's not that big a segment yet. So not too many people will spend more money. Now, there is a growing number of people who, given two choices, will pick the thing they think is greener. Whether it's actually better for the environment or not is a whole question about marketing and labeling and tricking people, and there's a whole story there, but that seems to be happening. A different question is this issue of globalization. So you have many companies like the ones in the industrial park in Tarragona, Dow Chemical, BASF, and these guys. They operate all over the world. So then the question that they must answer is, which standards should they have in their different operations in different countries? Should they have the same standard for the whole planet? Or should they obey the law, whatever the law is, in the US, in Northern Europe, in Southern Europe, in India, in China? It's a really, really complicated question for them, because if they do impose their standards from, say, Holland on their operations around the world, they may not be competitive in Africa, India, and China. However, if they follow one set of standards in one place and someplace else, Greenpeace might come and say, you are doing what they call ecological dumping, and they can try to attack them. On the third point is the license to operate. It's the opinion that civil society has about a company. And I'll talk about that. I'll give you an example of that. Now, what's really interesting is the financial community has already made the decision that the world will move in a more sustainable way. The share price of coal companies and oil companies is at an all-time low. The share price of environmental companies, Tesla, for example, is through the sky. Yeah, the stock market is betting their money on this transition, and that's really what I believe is driving a lot of the change. I'll give you an example about employees, where some companies are saying, I need to be more sustainable, not because my customers care or not because my shareholder cares, but because if I don't, I won't attract the young men and women I want to come and work for me. You know, so I don't know if after you leave IESE, some of you, and you go into industry, will you decide where to go based upon what kind of company it is? And some people are doing that. Catastrophic risks is if something really bad happens, companies can do lots of damage. In history, there's been many examples of terrible things which have happened. And part of the problem is that business leaders don't look at that properly. From a financial point of view, I'm not sure many of you studied finance, but if you look at, the value of something in the future is less than it is today, and the damage that a unlikely event far in the future might cause, if you do it in terms of how much you should spend to avoid that, it's very difficult to make the business case to avoid that. So it's quite a complicated thing for companies to understand that there are fundamental risks in some of their products and services. And the last idea which I'll share is financial scientific progress. But the license to operate is, there's a growing movement around the world of people who want to stop plastic pollution. And they might stop buying products which are wrapped in plastic, which is making all the consumer products companies in the world, I'll give you a specific example from a packaging company in a minute, the need to develop stuff which does all the wonderful things that plastic does in terms of keeping food fresh, in terms of keeping it clean, in terms of making things attractive. All of that needs to happen, but we have to find a sustainable way to do that. And I understand from Amelia that some of you are working on this kinds of stuff. The point about science is that what is true today may not be true tomorrow, and scientific inquiry is finding out new stuff all the time. James Lovelock, you might have heard of him. He's kind of the father of modern ecology. He invented this idea of Gaia. And he invented in the 1950s something called the electron capture device, which was the first time we could measure air pollution. So because before you could measure air pollution, you couldn't really talk about it. And that's just started in the 50s. Detergent. And in the 1940s, the Tide detergent, this idea that washing powder could clean your clothes really well was a revolutionary idea. But it was only 20 years later that they realized that the phosphates in the detergent was causing algae blooms in rivers and lakes around the world, which was choking off marine life and destroying the ecosystems. And because you wash your clothes with phosphates, the water eventually gets someplace. The phosphates cause things to grow, and that changes the ecology. So most detergents around the world are now made without phosphates, but it took the world a long time to do that. The latest example I know well is this amazing additive to plastic called BPA. I'm not going to try to pronounce its chemical name, although some of you probably know it. But BPA makes really good, clear, hard plastic. The problem is that the BPA molecule resembles an estrogen molecule at the atomic level. And there is concern that a baby's development might be altered if they had trace amounts of BPA. And because of that concern, you can no longer use BPA for baby bottles in the European Union. You can still use them in the United States, but you have to label them. And if you talk to any of my daughter's friends, they're all using BPA-free baby products because they're concerned about this. There's no scientific evidence, but there is concern. And the question is, do we apply what's called the precautionary principle, which is let's not do something if it's dangerous, just in case. But the idea here is that what you guys are doing collectively, the scientific community, is changing the rules of the game. And business leaders need to understand that, because what you do today, if it proves to be harmful to the environment tomorrow, the company is still liable for that damage. And you can lose a company because of that. So all of this put me together, made me come up with this framework, and it's got two parts to it. One I call environmental sensibility, which is how much does a company care about the environment? Is it about the regulator, the shareholders, the customers, the employees, etc.? And the other is how much they do. And there's a line which is, okay, you have to at least obey the law, which I think is important. And this helps me come up with 6 different strategies. There's one strategy I call break the law, and I do not recommend it to companies. But if you don't know a better example, think about Volkswagen, where the company deliberately programmed its cars to behave in one way when they're being tested and another way on the highway, breaking the law in the United States, producing tons and tons of particulates, which they shouldn't have done, and they ended up paying $20 billion to fix the problem and say they're sorry. Now they're spending another $24 billion on launching a fleet of electric vehicles to kind of wash their image and get people to say that Volkswagen is a good company, because it was really badly tarnished by this example. But then there are different strategies depending upon where you are. Some companies take the low road, meaning they just apply the law, which I think is okay, because the law is what the law says. Wait and see is about, I think I should start investigating this stuff. Even if it's not important today, it might be important tomorrow. Show and tell is I'll give you some examples of companies which are doing a lot and telling the world everything they're doing. And then there's 2 others which I think are a little bit farther. One is what I call pay for principle. This is the Patagonias of the world, companies where the founder says, I want to do this. I'm the founder, it's my money, I'm going to do it anyway. Now, sometimes those guys find a market segment which will pay more money for their stuff, so it all works out. And sometimes they just do it anyway because they own the company. Think ahead is when a company is convinced, and I'll show you an example in a minute, that the future is going to be different, and therefore they start working towards that future today, because it might take 10 or 15 years for them to get there. So this is the model. I won't spend any more time on it. And here are some examples. The rest of this talk is just examples. This is the British Retailers Association, which they've tried to sign up all the people who sell things, all the retailers in England, signed up together to show their path towards more sustainable future. And you can see these brands. These are all the big supermarkets, all the big chains, and they've got targets for 2030 and 2035, and they're being very public about their targets, which I think is useful. Another example is what are called science-based targets, and you're probably familiar, just in case anybody isn't. The latest IPCC report I showed you, with the one with the carbon emissions, they say the world has to decarbonize, and in their report they say, well, the steel industry has to decarbonize by this much. So if a steel company sends its paperwork to these guys and says, we will decarbonize by the same amount as it says in the report, they can put a stamp on their organization saying they're following science-based targets. So all of these companies have published their targets in line with this idea. 393, their targets would be consistent with a 1.5 degree change. The others are to a 2 degree change. Yeah, but the point is that they've looked at the math, they've done the math, and these are consumer products companies, energy companies, car companies, all kinds of companies. So you can start to see that there's kind of this movement happening, which is interesting. There's another one which they call the race to zero, and a lot of organizations are making a lot of noise for this for the upcoming meeting in Glasgow, which is to say, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030 or by 2035, and we're going to decarbonize our entire company. Now, what that really means typically is there are some things which are quite easy to do, and some things which are quite hard to do. In this, they measure it in terms of different levels of involvement. So scope 1 emissions, if you're not familiar with the terminology, is what an organization does in its own place. So scope 1 emissions for the business school is what do our classrooms emit? And the answer is very little, because they're just classrooms. We don't have smokestacks, we don't have industrial processes. Scope 2 is where do you buy your electricity, or your power. So one of the things the school did recently is we already had it in Barcelona, but we've now hired, we've talked to the supplier in Madrid, and now all of the electricity in the school is theoretically carbon neutral, provided by operators here in Spain who have their own windmills. This is relatively easy. Scope 3 is what everybody who's connected to you does in helping you do what you do. Your suppliers, your customers, all this kind of stuff. In our case, the biggest scope 3 emissions are the airplane rides and the motor scooters that our students use to get to school. So they have to fly in from 60 different countries, and they have to get to school every day. So those are emissions which we need to be responsible for somehow. So you think about how to get to zero, and typically it's easy to do some things, it's hard to do others. And then whatever's left over, what's really or impossible to do, you can compensate by funding projects in a different part of the world, where someone's going to build a solar panel park instead of a coal plant. And the United Nations has a whole system in place to validate those things. They're called offsets. And there's good ones and bad ones. But anyway, lots of companies, the fashion industry is the fashion companies for climate action, or the local governments, or the higher education sustainability. There's all these different groups which are signing up to this kind of stuff, which is interesting. Now, this is an image of a data center that Google operates in Eemshaven, I'm pronouncing it badly, in the Netherlands. What do you see when you look at the picture? You see the data center in the foreground, and in the background you see wind generators, and then across the sea you see another wind farm. Google is carbon neutral, and not only are they carbon neutral year by year, they've actually compensated for all the carbon they've created since the company was founded. Now, why does Google care if it's carbon neutral? Will we use Google more because it's carbon neutral? Doesn't matter. Will their shareholders be happier? Maybe. I think the reason they're doing it is because if you want to hire the best women and men in California who know how about programming computers and building the businesses that Google wants to build, if you're not carbon neutral, they won't come and work for you. So for me, it's about employee branding, and in their overall costs, they can pay a little bit more for electricity. So again, this is kind of where different companies go, and they do different things. A big announcement last year. This is the CEO of General Motors, wearing a leather jacket and looking hip and cool, announcing a couple of months ago that General Motors was going to stop making normal cars in 2035 and will be zero emissions in 2040. And she announced their brand new electric vehicle platform and all their new electric vehicle models, and how many thousands of engineers they have, and how great battery chemistry they're using, and how GM is basically going to beat Tesla. Why are they doing that? In my view, it's because if you look at the stock price of Tesla today, and you multiply that by how many shares, this gives you something called the market cap, or the valuation that the stock market gives to a company. Today, the market capitalization of Tesla is greater than GM, Ford, Toyota, Volkswagen, et cetera, combined. And Tesla makes 500,000 cars a year. GM makes 7 million, 8 million, including what they make in China. But it's worth 10 times more. So I think Mrs. Barra is saying, okay, we want to have some of that stock market lift. But really, the entire auto industry is racing to put electric vehicles in the streets. And this is going to be part of the change. Many of these companies, what you'll see them doing is dressing up what they're doing in terms of the 17 goals that the UN set up for the Sustainable Development Goals. You're probably familiar with them. If not, they're interesting because they talk about all the things that humanity should do by 2030. We do training at IESE Business School for the United Nations Development Program, which is partly responsible for this. And one of their senior people told me that he felt that this COVID pandemic has probably set the world back 10 years in its quest to make this happen. The reason I'm mentioning this to all of you is if your science is connected to one of these goals, then everybody will support you. You'll be able to find money, energy, anything you want, because this is really what the world is talking about in terms of where we want to go. Here's just one example. This is British Petroleum, an oil company, but they tell, and this is right from their sustainability report, but they tell, we're in the energy with purpose business, and they explain how they contribute to each of these, or to some of these sustainable development goals. And you can read this kind of stuff as you will. Here's another example. This is Shell, and here you can see that Shell is talking about all the goals, but specifically goal 8, which is about economic growth and work, goal 13, which is climate action, again, an oil company, etc. Dow Chemical, a neighbor of ISIC. They have a huge operation in Tarragona. This is their 2025 goals, which is to push for circular economy, climate protection, and safer materials. Now, this is one of the largest manufacturers of the plastic, which ends up in the sea on the planet. Their 2030 goals, though, is that were their 2030 goals is that they'll be they're going to reduce their emissions and push even stronger towards the circular economy. And one of the things they talked about in their sustainability report was this new agility stuff, which is basically made with what they call post-consumer resins, PCRs, or recycled plastic. So the idea of these big companies pushing really hard to find this stuff, and again, they will be delighted with anybody who can help. Another company we do training for at the IESE Business School is Amcor. Amcor is the world's largest manufacturer of plastic packaging material, and their CEO Ron Delio decided one day to make a commitment that by 2025, 100% of their products will be recyclable. Now, you have to listen carefully to the words, because just because something is recyclable doesn't mean it gets recycled. Recycling rates in Europe for glass are pretty good, but for plastic aren't quite so strong, because this requires people to separate stuff. It requires things to be processed. It adds cost. But anyway, his goal is to be recyclable. Now, I spent some time with some of the executives of the company, and in this case, the CEO made the speech, and then everybody in the company started to figure out how to do it, and they don't really know. One of their challenges is many of their machines don't work well with post-consumer resin, with recycled material. So they have to change their packaging machines, and they have to invest in new chemistry to do that, et cetera, which is very, very interesting. Now, these guys are a member, like other companies, in a whole bunch of things, but one thing in particular, which is the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. And there's a bunch of companies in the cluster which are also part of this thing. BASF, Clariant, Dow, Shell. They've signed on to the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. I'm not sure they know how. They're investing in recycling schemes around the world, but I don't think they really have the chemistry to unlock this stuff. And I think they're waiting for you guys to develop it, to be honest. But they're making the announcements already. Then I wanted to share this company with you. This is called Mont. This is in Umbria in Italy. And 20 years ago, these people bought a plastics refining company which had gone broke. They bought the factory, and they've converted the factory to making bioplastics. They make about 100 tons a year of bioplastics. They call their product Matter B. It took them 10 or 15 years of research to get the chemistry right, but they're taking thistles. Thistles are wild weeds, and they harvest the thistles, and they're turning the thistles into plastic. Basically, it's biodegradable, and it's also recyclable. It's a fascinating story. It's a fascinating business story. It's a successful business story, but the worldwide production of bioplastics is limited. I was speaking to another company, a Brazilian company, which makes what they call non-woven fibers. These are plastic cloths for face masks and for diapers. Their problem is they cannot get enough bioplastics because the world is not making enough bioplastics. There's not enough factories making bioplastics to satisfy demand. This is, according to one source, the worldwide production of bioplastics. And I understand they're doing about they're projecting 2.8 million tons. And you say, well, that's a lot. But I read somewhere that the plastics industry is making 360 some odd million tons a year. So if you divide 2 by 360, you can get a sense that, the plastics business is enormous and the bioplastics business is just starting. Now, again, this is about factories, chemistry, scalability, and all this important stuff. So just to finish, you can't imagine the interest that government and civil society is putting into these things. Just an example of that is what they call the hydrogen valleys. Just one example from Spain is the guys in Mallorca are trying to turn Mallorca into a hydrogen economy. There's 29 different demonstration projects. Much of it's funded with government money. The volumes are relatively small. In Mallorca, for example, they're talking about making 1 ton of hydrogen a day from renewable energies. So you can ask lots of questions about this kind of stuff, but the important thing is there is enormous interest with, the Joe Biden administration is all about sustainability, the new Green Deal in the United States, the new European Green Deal. And all of this means that there's attention, there's public money, there's noise going on, and it's possible to join these kinds of initiatives if someone's interested. So the last thing I want to talk about is a little bit what's going to happen next. And I'll share two points of view, one from Shell and the other from a gentleman I know pretty well called Vincent Petit from Schneider Electric. Shell, like many of the oil companies, looks at what's going to happen in the future. They have 3 scenarios on the Shell scenario thing. I'm only going to share 2. One they call waves, which will be different economic waves of prosperity and crisis, prosperity and prices, different fads coming in. But they see the world gradually shifting their energy mix towards renewable electricity by 2100 and probably getting to net zero by that year with a net increase in temperature of 2.5 degrees, which is going to be devastating to coastal cities in many parts of the world. They also have a scenario they call Sky, which is to get to net zero sooner, and this would stabilize the climate about 1.5 degrees. But if you look at this, it's all very demand driven. They're thinking about what kind of energy is going to make the demand, because there's tremendous demand of energy. These hundreds of millions of people coming out of poverty, they want to have a nice life. They want refrigerators and motorcycles and air conditioners and all this kind of stuff. And all this is going to need more and more energy. Mont says something different. Mont is the head of the institute at Schneider Electric. They build the equipment we're going to need for a transition to a low carbon future, the transformers, the circuit breakers, these kinds of things, at grid scale, at microgrid scale, and at housing scale. So they build all 3 levels. So you could say that he's got a point of view, but I know the guy pretty well. He says our current society is inefficient. It's very fragile, and we've seen this with COVID-19. And I'm sorry, there's this misspelling in my slide. It's unsustainable, not unattainable, unsustainable. That we just can't go on like this. If there's hundreds of millions of people live the way we do, the world is kaput. So he says something's got to change. And he thinks the combination of renewable energy, energy storage, all types of digitalization and atomic scale technology. Some of the stuff that you guys are doing in the lab is going to create the building blocks for a demand-driven story, which is going to go much faster than people think. So if we can really make thin film solar, which costs 100th time less than the current silicon product, everybody on the planet is going to put solar panels on the roof, which is going to create a distributed energy paradigm. And it's not because we'll have to prohibit burning coal. No one's going to want the damn stuff because it's cheaper to buy thin film solar. And this will, in Vincent's opinion, make all of this happen very, very quickly over the next 10 or 15 years as the science comes online and as it's combined with different things to find different applications, different products, different services that people actually want to buy and own and use. He thinks the cost of energy is going to come crashing down. It's going to become distributed and it's going to become clean. So he's very hopeful about the future. His new book, which I'm reading now, it's not out yet, is called The Age of Fire is Over. And I think it's very, very, very hopeful. Yeah, I think it comes out in a couple of months. I'm supposed to write something on the back of the book, which is why I'm reading it now. But there is hope for this. And I think a lot of the hope sits with the scientific community, which is why when Emilio was kind enough to come to my class, I'd be delighted to talk to your guys because I think what you guys are doing is tremendously important. Anyway, Nuria, that's what I had to talk. We got 16 minutes left for questions if you want to do that, but I'm all yours. Nuria, you're still on mute.
Thank you very much for this wonderful trip around all these things that I have never thought consciously, I think. And I guess that everybody can put the questions in either in the questions and answer section. We have already one. That's the easiest. And then Judith tries to shift the people. So the first one comes from my group. You see, my people is very interested. And that's Fede. So Federico Dattila is a PhD student in my group, and I hope that Judith can incorporate him.
Yeah, can you listen to me already?
Yeah. Buongiorno, Federico.
Well, buongiorno. Thanks a lot, Professor Mike Rosenberg, for this amazing talk. It was very much needed, I think, for us scientists to learn about the perspective that we have. So my question is kind of general. Let's say, like, if I am a young researcher, like, to give the strongest contribution for this climate change fight, should I stay in academia? Should I go, like, to a big industry? Should I create my own small industry? Or should I become a policymaker? So should I become a politician instead? I know that the answer is that there is a synergy of all the factors, but where do you think is the strongest impact for implementing those changes? Thanks a lot.
Grazie for the question, Federico. My question to you is what really moves you? Are you someone who just loves being in the lab and finding out and trying to understand what's true is what drives you? Then I would stay in the lab. If what moves you is to see stuff in the world, then I would go to industry or go to a startup. And if you feel that the real problem has to do with that the policymakers don't really know what the hell they're talking about, then I would consider thinking about something in government where you can become one of those policymakers or help advise them and get on panels to do that. In real life, though, and it's hard for me to tell how old you are, Federico, but you're probably in your late 20s or early 30s, more or less. You'll probably do all of that in your life. The probability is you will live to 80 or 90. And you'll probably have an opportunity to spend some years in the lab, some years in a startup. The startup will go well and you'll have lots of money to do something else, or it will go badly. You'll have to go back and get a job. And at some point in your life, you'll be relatively well known in whatever community you're in, and someone will ask you to be on a government panel. So I don't know if you have to choose to, because you probably have a chance to do everything, but I would urge you to do what's in your heart, what's going to make you the most excited and the most passionate, because whatever makes you the most passionate, you'll do the best, and then you'll have the biggest impact.
Very clear. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. And Wonderful answer, actually. So JR is also in having a question. JR Mascaros is one of the group leaders at ICAQ. And he's working, he had one of the first European projects to deal with CO2 conversion with electrochemical models. And he's the head, and I hope that he can jump into.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm ready. Thank you, Nuria.
Do you have a camera, sir? Do you have a camera with your machine?
Yes, but I'm not allowed to use the camera because I'm not a panelist.
Oh, okay, never mind. Okay, Federico has his picture at least.
Now
Go
you
ahead.
can, GR, if you want. Now you
I
can.
have been upgraded. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor, for your nice talk. Excellent, and we learn a lot about the business case. We try to learn more from companies. I have a couple of questions. I will have many, so we should meet one day. But just 2 questions, maybe controversial, but people at ICAQ know I like to go to the gray areas. You mentioned Tesla as a paradigm of ambiental concern company. But actually, LCA is not so good for Tesla. And if you look at mining problems, and there's many.
So let me be clear. I talk about Tesla because of its stock market value.
I know.
Not necessarily because of its ecological component, but Tesla is an interesting story. And sure, they have cobalt, which they're mining from the Congo, and they have and their battery chemistry is what it is, et cetera, and all of that's true. But what these guys did is first they built a silly little car which only rich people would buy to prove that they could. Then they built an expensive car which high-end people could, which was just as good as their BMW, so they started to buy them. And with that, they convinced a bunch of shareholders to give them the money to build the popular car. What Tesla's amazing about is one is the theory of change that Mr. Musk has in his head. And the other part of the story, and I think not everybody gets this, is that they're not really a car company. The company is about the transition to a low carbon economy. And it's really about appealing to the stock market. Now, Tesla will have to clean themselves up, but I do understand that they are working really hard with Panasonic, which makes the batteries, to develop a cobalt-free chemistry. Because it's hard to get the cobalt, and cobalt has a problem because it's the Congo and the DRC, et cetera, et cetera. So I think they're working on it, but this is the guy who wants to go to Mars. He wants to die on Mars. I mean, I'm not sure how much he's committed to. Another guy I know very well in this space, or I know of, says, I don't want to leave. I don't want to go to Mars. I want to fix the Earth. So you can criticize Mr. Musk and Tesla all you want, but what's really interesting is that the stock market thinks that he's got it right. And once the stock market makes their decision, then industry will follow. And that's really the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, I mean, I was not criticizing the company. I was just pointing out that market value comes from opinions, not from facts necessarily. And this is.
But it doesn't make it wrong. Yeah, and he's using this to drive the world.
And that comes to my second question, because sometimes in this transition there's a lot of promises that paint an unrealistic landscape. You mentioned, no, if everybody puts solar panels on their roofs, I mean, this is not enough. And you show the Google farm. They have all these windmills, which are fantastic, only for this small company. So I mean, we are convinced that the transition needs to take place, but we should convince society that there's a price to pay. We need to fill solar panels a lot of areas, and there will be we need to fill some lands and some sea areas of windmills.
Yes and no, because the question is, I mean, if you look at how much energy the sun is pouring on the earth every hour the sun puts enough energy on the earth to run the entire society for a year. The problem is we don't know how to convert it well, And if we use existing technologies, if we use current generation windmills, silicon, solar, etc., it's not going to work. The question is there better answers at the nano level? And my hope is that your guys are going to find them.
I'm sorry, but you don't have the numbers right. But I will be happy to share with you. It can be done. The sun gives enough solar energy in the whole sphere of the Earth, not all Madrid for Madrid or Tarragona for Tarragona. It can be done, but there's a price to pay. And we need to convince society that we need to invest in renewables and to use the land for renewables. If we tell them this will happen with nanochemistry on the roofs, the numbers don't match up, and it will be difficult to power it.
I don't know. I'm not a chemist. I'm not a physicist, but I understand that quantum dots can do better than. Don't worry, we can talk anytime. Come to Barcelona, we have lunch.
But you have the wrong science, and this is very important. When people say science said something, no, we need to be realistic and honest. Quantum dots cannot improve silicon, and it doesn't matter how much you improve it. There's a limit to the physics, and there's a limit to the areas you need, and bringing to.
And there's a limit to the time.
Yeah, sorry, but bringing. we should be honest to society. You want.
No, but let me take one thing which you did mention, which I think is important, is General Motors has said that they're going to only make electric cars after 2035, but they may change their mind. So there's a lot of these public statements, these forward statements, which may not happen, and there's a lot of noise in the data. So we have to be a little bit careful. But don't worry, I'm not a kind of complete blind zealot in this story. But what I do see is companies spending a lot of money on this stuff today, which gives tremendous opportunities for science to find applications and to see how far we can go with today's science and tomorrow's science, etc. But anytime we can have a lunch. Nuria.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I will come also to the lunch. I have also few opinions on that. Next question comes from someone that has raised a hand. So Javier Perez, I think that Judith has put you in the right place. You can ask your question.
Javier, are you there?
Javier.
I'm trying to unmute his microphone, but I think that there's a problem because.
Otherwise, he can write the question.
Now.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mike, for your talk. It's really nice to see that there are education initiatives on sustainability and the economic rise of companies that are based on this area of business. Is nice to see that. But why? My question is why all these initiatives came from always United States the leader in new markets. So what happens there that
in developing countries you have two things going on. One is, in many developing countries people don't have electricity. So the Prime Minister of India, said, listen, until I give all my people electricity, please leave me alone. I have coal in the ground. Let me use the coal we have. Let me get my people to be rich. You guys in the West, you want me to use cool renewable energy? Fine, you pay for it, I'll use it. So one of the ideas, and there's a thing in ecology called the upside down Kuznets curve, which is, when people are poor, they want electric lights, they want a motorcycle, they want to improve their life. Now, if you talk to people in San Francisco, which is tremendously rich, they say, no, we need to clean the air. We need to be sustainable because they can afford to be. Now, the other question is, so you would think that maybe San Francisco is actually cleaner than Shanghai or New Delhi because the people care more. But what's interesting is, in fact, they're so much richer that even if their unit of wealth, the contamination or the CO2 per unit of wealth is lower, they're just so rich that they still produce more. But the U.S. is special. We have a very special entrepreneurial culture. We have a special links between universities and business people. We have a really good ecosystem and some of that stuff, which has allowed some of the stuff to happen. Now, that doesn't mean it's only the U.S. And at our school, we have a colleague who's on the call, Luca Venza, who's putting scientists together with startups all the time. This is something that Europeans are increasingly doing really well. So I think you'll see more and more leaders coming out of Europe as this thing gets underway. Now, will they come from China? Maybe. China is now the world leader in electric vehicles, in wind generators, in solar panel production, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's going to be a race to see who's going to build this stuff. I think one of the arguments of the new president of the United States, Joe Biden, is the United States was way ahead. It's fallen behind China in the race to build the equipment you need for this. And under his administration, they're going to put a lot of money behind getting back ahead. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question properly, but
yeah, well, we should learn how to create or improve this ecosystem about connecting the links between science, technology, and also the business. Maybe
people with the money.
Absolutely. In this country, we need that.
This is why we are here today. So next question comes from Sergio Pablo Garcia.
Hello.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the talk. Very nice. I have a question regarding the civil opinion about the civil concern about the green movement to the green movement of the industry, because when I talk to civil persons or when I talk to normal people, with no scientist formation, they are concerned by the green industry, and they are concerned about the climate change, and they are concerned about the plastics, but they don't know nothing about the climate change. They don't know nothing about the whole plastics are created or whole plastics are recycled. And I don't know if the industry it's changing the opinion of the people to create a massive marketing movement to buy greener products, or if scientists change the thing that people have about the world itself, or about the
I think I get your question, Sergio. The problem is most people don't read anything ever.
Yeah.
So for example, there was a famous study some years ago when the Toyota Prius came out, the first hybrid car, and it's ecological and it's nice in California. And the story behind the hybrid car is it gets much better fuel economy, so it's cheaper to run. It breaks less often, so it's cheaper to maintain. And if you do the math of the overall life expenses of your car, it was much cheaper than a normal car. They found in California that 3% of the people who bought a Prius did the math. The other 97% bought it because it was cool.
Yeah.
And the reality is if you dive into anything about how sustainable it is, and is it really sustainable, and what do they really mean, it's all really complicated. It all depends. It all depends on your assumptions. And when you do, nobody will do that math. So what the Vincent Petit says is people will change, not when you convince them with arguments or educate them as to the costs. They'll change when you can offer them things which are better. They're cheaper to do the same thing, or they do more for the same price. They're just better. And my conviction is he's right, that people will, when they see fruit packed in bioplastics, and there's a sticker which says, you can throw this away with the extra fruit, yeah, and it'll keep your stuff just as fresh for just as long. Okay, I'll buy that one instead. It's easier to use. I don't have to separate it. I don't have to bring it to the recycling bin. I can just throw it away in the same thing I use for the organic. Yeah, it'll be when people, it's either more convenient, cheaper, or just better. I think that's when people will change, because I don't think they'll ever do the math. At least not normal people. There'll be, crazy people like myself who spend a lot of time on this stuff, but you cannot build a business with them.
Yeah.
No. We have a very little profit. Thanks, Sergio, for the question.
Thank you for the answer.
I have a question myself, and this is related. We are seeing these very strong movements against solar panels and the deployment of windmills close to the coast in all the area in Catalonia, for instance. How are we going to convince all these people that we need?
Well,
yes.
Let me go back to James Lovelock. James Lovelock, again, fantastic scientist, founder of ecology. He feels windmills are ugly. And he thinks to spoil the landscape so that wasteful cities can continue to be wasteful is just ridiculous. Now, if you put the windmills offshore, maybe it doesn't matter. But the part of the answer, Nori, is I think we have, we waste so much energy. 50% of buildings is wasted. 50% of the efficiency of our cars is so low. To substitute our coal plants with windmills and spoil the nature is a bad plan. I think windmills have a role to play where the wind blows strong, where they're in the right place. But we need it needs to be a complete transformation, and it's got to be beautiful at the end. Otherwise, why bother? So I think now people push back when it affects their home. So I've been walking on the beach in Sitges. I don't think anybody wants to put wind generators on the beach in Sitges. They wouldn't make any money anyway because the wind changes direction. Yeah. Now, should you put wind generators at the top of the ridge of the mountains behind Tarragona? Maybe. So I think this is where public policy and the governmental process has to work itself out, where citizens and local people can make decisions about what to do with their own place. But I think it's got to be a combination of efficiency, new technology, the right technology in the right place. And I think if we do all that together, we can get through this.
Okay, I'm not really so convinced. So we have two more questions.
Okay, we can come to lunch with me and Professor Galan Mascaros.
Fede, just make it short for one, and then we will have
I will be very short because it's a follow-up. So how should we address the problem that you just say, energy savings? Because as you say, like we are talking about CO2 reduction, like electric car, but at the end, as you said, one of the sectors that is producing more like pollution is actually like heating and cooling system in the house. And I think that like neither industries or a lot of government, at least.
But the big opportunity, Federico, is energy efficiency does not need new science. It needs insulation. It needs better windows. It needs better plumbing. It needs using geothermal, using heat pumps instead of air conditioning. It uses things which we already know how to do. And probably the most important part, at least from my view, is as we automate the world, as we have more digitalization and more expert systems and more automation, we're going to need jobs for a lot of people. And building that infrastructure, rebuilding the world's infrastructure to make it more efficient is not very complicated. It just takes time and energy.
Yeah, but then why government are not pushing that much on that? I mean, at least to my understanding, in the south of Europe, for instance.
Governments are pushing a lot. You'd be surprised. You have to dig into the details. Again, nobody reads this stuff.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
And the last question, just please, Nathan, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much for the great talk, Professor. So I really like the point where you mentioned that Google is actually already retroactively working back its carbon footprint, because there is another aspect where, as you mentioned, we have also polluted our oceans. So all of these strategies that you've talked about, they look towards incorporating newer types of materials. But I'm kind of wondering, is there any type of consensus from the business community or kind of vision on what to do with the plastics that we've already generated that are not that easy to technologically handle? Thank you very much.
There are initiatives, Nathan, to actually collect it. The good news is the sea actually blows the big pieces into the same place. The microplastic in the ocean is more complicated to get, but I do know about a project to actually get at the microplastics. But the answer is when someone can figure out a way to use that plastic as raw material for something else, to give it some value, which is a little bit higher than the value of harvesting it. And when that combination is cheaper than the alternative, it'll happen by itself. You'll find entrepreneurs building fleets of ships to go collect the stuff because it's valuable. This is where we have to get to. And if you guys can invent some enzymes in the lab which can somehow take that stuff and make it do something useful, and that's going to help. So I think we're going to find solutions when we can get either government to say, okay, let's deal with this problem, or we can get entrepreneurs to say, here's an opportunity. I know a gentleman, for example, who runs a gold mine in China, but the gold isn't in the ground. It's in electronic waste that he buys from Japan. So he buys old computers and old phones and old televisions from Japan, and then he breaks them up into little pieces and harvests the precious metals in the garbage and makes a fortune. So this is the kind of stuff which is going to change the world, I think.
Okay, it seems that we have a final question coming from Salim Munir. I'm very sorry, but I forgot you, so I haven't seen the hand raised. So that's the last one. Salim Munir.
Hello, Salim.
Yeah, please.
Salim, you have to give me the permission now. Can you try to speak?
Yeah, can you please hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, yes. You're a little bit soft, Salim, but I can hear you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for the informative lecture, and I think it's my last question, and the time is very short. So, my question is, can you please discriminate about the developing countries policy and developed country policy? Because it's very easy for developed countries to go to sustainability rather than developing countries, because their main goal is to feed their population.
Absolutely.
Because
Salim,
the poverty level, you know, the
Salim,
poverty
you're
level.
absolutely right that the main primary goal of most developing countries is to get their people out of poverty.
Yeah.
Now there's a possibility, and the best metaphor is the cell phone networks. So when we used to build telephone systems, we needed central telephone stations and wires, and to run the wires over the mountains to the village was terribly expensive. When we brought in the cell phone networks, though, to put a line of sight antenna from mountain to mountain and to get the cell phone coverage into the small village was actually much cheaper. And if you look at telephone rates across many developing countries, they've gone much faster thanks to mobile technology, because it doesn't need all the damn wires and it's cheaper to deploy. So really, for me, the medium-term hope, and I don't think we're there today, is if some of these new technologies, thin film solar, for example, if we can leapfrog and just bypass some of these issues. You know, sub-Saharan Africa does not have enough electric power. To build enough power plants to bring it up to where it needs to be, you know, you have to dam every river, build so many power plants. It's going to be very complicated. It's going to produce lots of pollution and destroy the rivers and the lakes. However, if there is energy breakthrough, perhaps in many developing countries we can leapfrog the story. For example, if every person in the world were to buy, you know, plastic shampoo bottles like many of us have in our house, that's just too much plastic. But if we can come up with bioplastics which degrade naturally, where people can use them, et cetera, et cetera. So the real hope, I think, is by developing technology today, which in 20 or 30 years could be deployed massively, and thus leapfrog some of the challenges and some of the problems we've had. To me, that's the best chance we have. And I always come back to science and business, which have to work together, which is why I was so happy to accept this invitation. It's just been a pleasure to speak to you all. And I really, I recognize the skepticism from Mr. Galan, or Professor Galan Mascaros, and he's right that we have to be realistic, but don't stop dreaming, because you guys might come up with a breakthrough, which is going to make all the stuff in the heads of people my age just irrelevant, because there's going to be something even better. So thank you so much, and all the best.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for staying till the end, and thank you for this wonderful trip. And we are too old, so maybe it's not time for us to do this business, but for all the young people, I hope that they will find a place where to go and help for this new society. Thanks a lot, Mike. And we see sometime, whenever it's possible, very soon.
In Tarragona or Barcelona, anywhere you like.
Exactly. Thank you. Ciao.
Okay, bye-bye.